In this video I just want to cover off how to validate properties or objects. DatabaseObjects provides a constraint library or framework, very simple one, and what that allows us to do is to share the validation log between the UI and the objects and the model. What often happens is we violate the don't repeat yourself principle and have a bit of code that's in the model, but also have that same code in the user interface. So what this tries to do is consolidate that and have that just in the model, so we're not sharing or repeating our validation code. What it essentially allows you to do is to bind that to, might be .NET WinForms or WPF or Mono or whatever user interface layer that you're using, in a consistent way, and it sort of can help a lot in making sure that your objects are in a valid state and the data is valid. So what I'm going to do is I've added a couple of properties to the order class. Now this is, in my opinion, not good because these fields can be assigned to pretty much anything. For example, this ship name could be null, or it could be something, or it could be 1,000 characters long. There's a lot of things that need to be checked, and if we just have a public getter setter, then there's no reason that someone could accidentally set it to something, and we're going to get some errors and some issues. So what we can do is we can create a constraint. There are a whole host of constraints that are part of the framework. The framework, by the way, is optional. You don't need to use this. It's just there if you want to use it. It's not really part of the mapping of objects or anything like that. So there's constraints for validating dates and emails and numbers and ensuring that things have actually been set. You've got objects assigned if there's a reference object. Strings are actually being set to a value that's not null. You're not exceeding lengths on database fields, etc. So there's a whole heap of inbuilt ones. Of course, you can write your own. Just inherit from iConstraint and write your own. So there's two aspects to it. There's the first aspect is the actual constraint itself, which is just a bit of code. If you just inherit from iConstraint, you can implement the interface and you've got validation there. I guess I can quickly show you a simple one. So if we have a look at the object is set constraint, we're implementing iConstraint and we're ensuring that the value has actually been set as not null, and we come up with a default error message. These messages can be customized. You can do your own thing there with callback. So this is the error message that will come up if that constraint doesn't pass. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do some validation on the ship name. I'm going to make this private, turn this into a field, and add a property down here called ship name. Just getter is going to return ship name, and do some validation here before we actually assign it the value. Okay, so the first step is to create the actual constraint. What we need to do is create a constraint here. We can probably create a read-only private one, ship name max length, and it's a string max length constraint. And we know that the ship name max length is 40 in the database. Yep, 40. So we've got the constraint. Now we want to bind that constraint to the actual value, so that whenever we are validating it, we're always validating against the latest value in this object. So I'm going to create a new constraint here that we can then share with the user interface if we want to. So I'm going to make it public, and we're going to have a constraint binding type string, and I'm going to call it ship name length is valid. make it read only, I think. It's up to you if you want to make it a property or not. So, create a new one. Okay, so the first argument to this is the actual value that we're going to bind against. So this is going to be the ship name. The second argument is the constraint. There's an optional error message you can pass. So you might say ship name is too long, or we can put in ship name and we can put in 0 as the actual value that would be there. That's optional. You can actually do error callbacks as well, so you can just pass a callback here and you can dynamically determine what the error message is. So that's enough for now, I think. Whoops, I've got the wrong next link there. Okay, so now when we have this constraint here, what we typically do is in the save, just to make sure that we actually, in a valid state, is ensure constraints satisfied. So if that constraint is not passing, i.e. we've got a really long ship name, then this will throw an error. And by default, it will display the error message from here, string length is too long. Okay, so the other thing we want to validate is, so there might be a situation where you don't actually call this property and therefore you can't assume that this validation, this has been correctly validated. So that's why I've got this validation down here. But you might probably always also want to validate this value coming in. So we can just duplicate the actual binding and just rebind to another value, which is the incoming value, and ensure constraint is satisfied. And again, that'll just throw an error if that value that we've passed in here is not going to pass that constraint. So what we're doing is pretty simple. It's nothing really that complicated, but what will happen is you just build a lot of constraints, and it makes the code a lot cleaner to read, and you've got the constraint in just one spot. You can create your own constraints and just have those little constraints and share them with within your model. So I think that's probably enough to start with. So let's just check that works. So if we go back to our application, open up an order. Just grab the first order, and we can do ship name valid. We might even bind this to, well, what we'll do for the moment is just ensure that, see if that constraint is passing. So let's check that on another line. Okay, so let's just run that, and that will pass by default. We're not going to exceed that length. Oops, I've done something wrong here. Okay, so the constraint passes is true. Now if we actually try to set the ship name to string that's say 100 characters, we should get an error. Okay, so value did not satisfy constraint. So the good thing about this is that basically it's impossible for this ship name to ever be set to something that's too long, and for that value to actually be saved to database. So there's lots of different types of constraints. This is using a predefined one. We can create our sort of use a generic constraint as well. So I'll just show how that works. So let's say we've got ship address. We'll do a different type of constraint as well. We want to make sure that this ship address is actually a value. So we can use, I'll show you the default way, the sort of simple way of doing it. would be just to get the ship address, and we should turn this into a private field. Okay. So we want to show ship address is set, and we'll clone that, rebind, shooks. So this will, what we want to do here is use a new object is set constraint. So this is another predefined constraint, and well, actually we want to use a string is set constraint, and again we can put that down the save as well. So it just sort of becomes a nice list of just all the constraints that you need to ensure they're satisfied. So this is the standard way you would do it, or you can do it. The other way is you can use there's another override that you can use for the constraint binding, which takes again the ship address, but it also takes just a callback, a function where you can pass, where you would get the address. So we can, I'll just add some just to make this a bit clearer. Ship address, then we've got constraint, and we pass through the ship address, so address, and we want to make sure that the address is null or empty. It's not null, empty, and finally we can have an error message. Okay, it's not being set. Okay, so this is synonymous. These two are exactly the same. That's an actual function callback. There we go. Okay, so these two are synonymous. They will work exactly the same way. This is just another way of specifying the constraints. We'll stick to this. And of course you might want to apply some validation on the length to the ship address, etc. So there's a few other constraints you might want to use. For example, with the date, there's a date is now or in the future. So this might be particularly useful if you're creating a new order and you want to make sure that the date can't be set to the past, because that doesn't make sense. One of the other ones is ensuring that there's a unique key within the collection. Key is unique within collection. So, for example, if we had an order, I guess, and we have an order number on it, we want to make sure that number, if we're creating a new one, that number is always unique within that orders table. But if it's a already existing record, then we don't care. We can assume that it's still unique. So that's another useful constraint. So that's all we wanted to show. Hopefully that's been useful.